Story 1. The Vanishing Hitchhiker. It was one of those nights when the world seemed to be holding its breath. The moon was a sliver in the sky, barely illuminating the stretch of highway ahead of me. I'd driven this road countless times before, a long, lonely route that wound through the countryside between my hometown and the small city where I worked. The kind of road where you could go miles without seeing another car, where the only company was the rhythmic thump of the tires on the asphalt and the occasional distant cry of a night bird. I had left my parents' house later than I'd planned, but the visit had been worth it. We'd spent the evening reminiscing, going through old photo albums and talking about everything and nothing. It had been comforting, a reminder of a simpler time before life had become so complicated. As I drove, my thoughts drifted to the week ahead. Another long stretch of work, with nothing to break the monotony but the drive back here next weekend. I sighed, trying to shake off the lingering melancholy that always seemed to settle over me on these late-night drives. That's when I saw her. She was standing on the side of the road, just where the pavement met the grass. At first, I thought she was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the trees or a reflection in my headlights. But as I got closer, it became clear she was real. A young woman, standing alone in the middle of nowhere, her long dark hair hanging loose around her shoulders, her white dress clinging to her in the damp night air. I slowed the car as I approached, the unease gnawing at my gut. Who would be out here at this hour, miles from the nearest town? She didn't seem to be in distress. She wasn't waving me down or calling for help, but there was something about her that made me want to stop. Maybe it was the way she stood there, so still and quiet, like she was waiting for something, or someone. I pulled over a few feet ahead of her and rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" I called out. She didn't answer right away, just stared at me with wide, dark eyes that seemed to take in everything and nothing at once. Then slowly she nodded. "Can you give me a ride?" Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried in the stillness of the night. "Sure," I said, trying to keep my tone light. "Hop in." She opened the door and slid into the passenger seat, her movements slow and deliberate. As she settled into the seat, I noticed her hands, pale and delicate, resting in her lap. They looked almost too still, like they were carved out of marble. I pulled back onto the road, the silence between us growing heavier with each passing mile. She didn't offer any explanation for why she was out here, and I didn't ask. There was something about her that made me feel like I shouldn't pry, like whatever she had to say wouldn't be something I wanted to hear. "Where are you headed?" I asked, finally breaking the silence. She turned to look at me, her eyes catching the dim light from the dashboard. "Just down the road," she said. "A little farther, past the old church." I nodded, though I wasn't sure which church she meant. There were a few scattered along the stretch of highway, most of them old and abandoned, relics of towns that had withered away over the years. The road ahead seemed to stretch on forever, the trees on either side closing in, their branches intertwining above us like a tunnel. The headlights cut through the darkness, but it felt like the night was pressing in around us, trying to swallow us whole. I glanced over at her again, but she was staring straight ahead, her expression unreadable. "What's your name?" I asked, more to fill the silence than anything else. She hesitated just for a moment. "Emily," she said finally. "Nice to meet you, Emily," I replied, though she didn't seem interested in small talk. I wondered what her story was, why she was out here alone. But something told me not to push it. There was a sadness about her, something deep and old that I didn't want to disturb. We drove in silence for what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes. The road twisted and turned, the trees growing denser, the darkness deeper. I had the strange sensation that we were leaving the world behind, slipping into some place that existed outside of time. Finally, she spoke. "You can drop me off here." I glanced around, trying to see where here was. There was nothing but trees and darkness, the road barely visible in the dim light. "Are you sure? There's nothing around." She nodded, already reaching for the door handle. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft and distant. I watched as she stepped out of the car, her figure almost disappearing into the night. "Be careful," I called after her, but she was already gone, swallowed up by the darkness. For a moment, I just sat there, my heart pounding in my chest. Something about the whole encounter felt wrong, like I'd just been part of something I couldn't quite understand. But there was no sign of her now, nothing to prove she had ever been there at all. With a heavy sigh, I put the car in gear and pulled back onto the road. The silence in the car felt even heavier now, the darkness pressing in on all sides. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd just seen something I wasn't supposed to see, something that didn't belong in this world. As I drove, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her standing on the side of the road, watching me go. But there was nothing, just the empty road stretching out behind me. Finally, I reached the turnoff for my town. The familiar streets and houses were a welcome sight, the lights in the windows a comfort after the oppressive darkness of the highway. I pulled into my driveway, the engine ticking as it cooled down. But as I sat there, staring at the darkened windows of my house, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had followed me home. Something I couldn't see but could feel, like a shadow lurking just out of sight. I shook my head, trying to clear the unease from my mind. It had been a long night and I was tired, too tired to think straight. I needed to get some sleep, to put this whole strange encounter behind me. But as I stepped out of the car, I saw it. Something small and shiny on the passenger seat where she had been sitting. I leaned in, my heart skipping a beat as I realized what it was. A locket, an old, tarnished locket, the kind that looked like it had been lost for years. I picked it up, turning it over in my hand. There was something engraved on the back, but the letters were too worn to make out. I opened it, expecting to find a picture inside. But there was nothing, just an empty space where a photo should have been. I stood there for a long moment, the locket cold in my hand, a chill creeping up my spine. I knew then that I hadn't been alone on that road, and that whatever had gotten into my car wasn't just a lost girl looking for a ride. It was something else, something older and darker. And now it was here with me. Story 2. The Whispering Woods. It was late when I decided to take a shortcut home through the Whispering Woods. I'd heard the rumors, of course, the ones about the strange noises and the shadowy figures that supposedly haunted these woods. But I never put much stock in urban legends. After all, I was a logical person, grounded in reality. That night, I had been at a friend's party, and the drive home was taking longer than expected. I'd been stuck in traffic for what felt like hours, and the shortcut through the woods seemed like the quickest way to get home. As I turned onto the narrow, winding road that led into the woods, the trees loomed over me, their branches intertwined like skeletal fingers reaching for the sky. The full moon barely penetrated the thick canopy, casting eerie shadows on the path ahead. I turned on my headlights, but the darkness seemed to swallow the light. The woods were unnervingly quiet, save for the occasional rustle of leaves or the distant hoot of an owl. I tried to shake off the growing unease, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. About halfway through, I noticed something peculiar, a series of small, faded signs nailed to the trees, each one bearing cryptic messages like, "Turn back" and "Danger ahead." I shrugged it off as some kind of local prank or perhaps a misguided attempt at keeping people out of the woods. The path narrowed, and the trees seemed to press in closer. My headlights picked up strange shapes darting between the trees, but whenever I looked directly, there was nothing there. I began to feel a sense of claustrophobia, the walls of foliage seeming to close in around me. That's when I heard it, a soft, whispering voice that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. It was like the wind itself was speaking, but the words were indistinguishable. I tried to convince myself it was just the wind playing tricks on my ears. I continued driving, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. They seemed to be calling my name, their tone urgent and pleading. My heart pounded as I tried to ignore the growing sense of dread. The road twisted and turned, and just when I thought I might be getting out of the woods, I saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop. The figure was tall and shrouded in darkness, and I couldn't make out any details. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice trembling. The figure didn't move or respond. I started to back up, but the whispering grew louder, more chaotic, drowning out everything else. As I reversed, the figure slowly approached the car, its shape becoming clearer. It was a gaunt, ghostly figure with hollow eyes and a mouth twisted into a silent scream. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to move or look away. Suddenly, the figure vanished, and the whispering stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I quickly shifted the car into drive and sped down the road, desperate to escape the suffocating darkness. When I finally emerged from the woods and back onto the main road, my hands were shaking, and I could barely keep the car steady. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the figure following me, but there was nothing, just the empty road stretching behind me. I made it home, but the experience left me rattled. The whispers and the ghostly figure haunted my thoughts, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far beyond my understanding. Over the next few days, I tried to find out more about the Whispering Woods. I learned that there had been several reports of strange occurrences and disappearances over the years. The locals spoke in hushed tones about the woods being cursed or haunted by restless spirits. I didn't know what I had encountered that night, but I knew one thing for sure: I would never take that shortcut again. The Whispering Woods had shown me that some legends have a basis in reality, and some things are better left unexplored. Story 3. The Phantoms, Lullaby. I was staying at my grandmother's old house while she was away on vacation. It was a quaint, two-story home nestled at the edge of a small town, surrounded by dense woods and overlooking a serene lake. It was a place full of memories from my childhood, but this time, something felt different. The house had always been quiet, but during my stay, an unsettling stillness pervaded the atmosphere. It wasn't just the silence. It was as if the silence itself was waiting, holding its breath for something I couldn't quite identify. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the house was bathed in the warm, orange glow of twilight, I decided to explore the attic. My grandmother's house had a large attic, one I'd never really explored before. I'd heard stories about it being a treasure trove of old family belongings and forgotten relics. I pulled down the creaky attic stairs and climbed up into the dimly lit space. The air was musty and thick with dust. I turned on the old lamp I found at the top of the stairs, its light casting eerie shadows on the walls. The attic was filled with boxes of old clothes, dusty furniture, and a collection of antiques. As I rummaged through the boxes, I came across an old, ornate music box. It was beautifully crafted, with intricate carvings of flowers and vines on its surface. I opened it, and to my surprise, it began to play a soft, haunting lullaby. The melody was both beautiful and eerie, its notes lingering in the air long after the music had stopped. I couldn't shake the feeling that the lullaby was familiar, but I couldn't place where I had heard it before. As the night deepened, I began to hear the music box's melody drifting through the house, even though I had left it in the attic. At first, I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me, but the music continued, its soft, sorrowful notes echoing through the empty rooms. I tried to ignore it, but the melody seemed to follow me. It would start softly, then grow louder, as if someone was winding the music box in a different part of the house. I decided to investigate, but every time I reached the source of the sound, it would stop abruptly, only to start again somewhere else. The following night, I was woken from a deep sleep by the sound of the lullaby. I lay in bed, frozen, as the music filled the room. It was so clear and close that it felt as though the music box was right next to me. I mustered the courage to get out of bed and follow the sound, but the moment I stepped into the hallway, the music ceased. The next morning, I found an old photograph tucked away in one of the attic boxes. It was a black and white photo of a young woman with a serene expression, holding a music box. Written on the back in faded ink was the name Eleanor, and below that, beloved daughter. I did some research and discovered that Eleanor was my great-grandmother, who had passed away many years ago under mysterious circumstances. According to family lore, she had been a talented musician who was known for her beautiful lullabies. However, there had been rumors about her tragic end, with some claiming she had died under unusual circumstances. That night, I felt compelled to return the music box to the attic. As I carried it up the stairs, I felt an inexplicable chill, as if I was being watched. The moment I set the music box down, the melody began playing softly once more. I tried to ignore it and went to bed, but sleep eluded me. The lullaby continued to play throughout the night, growing fainter as the hours passed. When morning came, I found the music box had mysteriously stopped, its lid closed. I left the house as soon as I could, eager to escape the unsettling presence that seemed to linger there. The Phantom's Lullaby, as I later learned it was called, was not just a haunting melody but a connection to a tragic past, one that seemed to reach across the years to touch those who dared to listen. Even now, I can't shake the feeling that something followed me from that house. The music box and its mournful tune have left an indelible mark on my memory, a chilling reminder that some melodies are better left undisturbed. Story 4. The Hiker's Warning. I've always loved hiking, especially in the fall, when the leaves turn golden and the air is crisp and cool. There's something about being out in nature, away from the noise and rush of the city, that makes me feel alive. That's why, when I heard about a remote trail deep in the mountains, I knew I had to explore it. The trail wasn't on any of the official maps, but a friend of mine, an avid outdoorsman, had mentioned it in passing. He told me it was a hidden gem, untouched by the usual crowds, with breathtaking views and a sense of isolation that was hard to find anywhere else. He also warned me that the trail was difficult to navigate and that I should be careful, but I brushed off his concerns. I was experienced and I had tackled more challenging trails before. I set out early one Saturday morning, my backpack filled with the usual supplies: water, snacks, a map, and a first aid kit. The drive to the trailhead took longer than expected, winding through narrow, twisting roads that seemed to go on forever. By the time I arrived, the sun was already high in the sky, casting long shadows across the dense forest. The trail was everything my friend had promised. It was rugged and wild, with steep inclines and rocky terrain. The further I hiked, the more I felt like I was leaving the world behind, stepping into a place untouched by time. The trees grew taller and thicker, their branches intertwining to form a canopy that blocked out most of the sunlight. The air was cool and damp, filled with the scent of earth and pine. I had been hiking for a few hours when I noticed something strange. The trail, which had been clear and well-trodden, suddenly seemed to disappear. The path ahead was overgrown with bushes and vines, as if no one had walked this way in years. I hesitated, wondering if I had taken a wrong turn, but I was sure I had followed the trail markers correctly. I decided to push on, figuring the trail would become clearer further ahead. But as I continued, the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees were packed tightly together, their branches forming a dense web that made it difficult to see more than a few feet ahead. The air grew colder, and an uneasy feeling settled in my gut. I finally stopped when I reached a small clearing. In the center of the clearing stood an old, weathered signpost. The wood was rotting, and the words carved into it were barely legible. But I could just make out the warning, "Turn back. Do not proceed. Danger ahead." I felt a chill run down my spine. The sign looked ancient, as if it had been there for decades, maybe even longer. I glanced around, trying to figure out what the danger might be, but there was nothing, just the thick forest and the silence that hung heavy in the air. Despite the warning, I felt a strange compulsion to keep going. I was curious, and a part of me didn't want to turn back without finding out what lay ahead. So, against my better judgment, I continued down the path, which had become little more than a narrow, overgrown trail. The forest grew darker as I descended deeper into the woods. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches reaching out like skeletal hands. The air was thick with fog, and the silence was so complete that I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. After what felt like hours, I stumbled upon something that made my blood run cold. In the middle of the trail, partially hidden by leaves and debris, was a shoe. It was old and tattered, the kind you'd expect to see on a hiker. But there was something wrong about it, like it had been there far too long, untouched by the elements. I picked up the shoe, examining it closely. There was no sign of the person who had worn it, no tracks or footprints. Just the lone shoe, lying abandoned in the middle of the trail. As I stood there, a sense of dread washed over me. I felt like I was being watched, like something was lurking just out of sight, waiting for me to make a move. I dropped the shoe and quickly turned to head back the way I came, but the trail was gone. The path I had been following had disappeared, swallowed up by the forest. I was surrounded by trees, their branches closing in around me, and I realized with a sinking feeling that I was lost. Panic set in as I tried to retrace my steps, but every direction looked the same. The fog grew thicker, and the forest seemed to shift and change around me. I called out, hoping someone might hear me, but my voice was swallowed by the silence. Hours passed, or maybe it was minutes, I couldn't tell. Time seemed to lose all meaning as I wandered through the dense woods, my fear growing with each passing moment. Just when I thought I couldn't go any further, I stumbled upon another clearing. In the center of this clearing was a small, dilapidated cabin. The windows were shattered, and the door hung loosely on its hinges. A feeling of dread washed over me, but I was desperate for shelter, for any sign of civilization. I approached the cabin cautiously, pushing the door open with a creak. The inside was dark and cold, the air thick with the smell of decay. The floorboards groaned under my weight as I stepped inside, my flashlight casting eerie shadows on the walls. There was nothing in the cabin, no furniture, no signs of life. Just an empty, abandoned space that felt like it hadn't been touched in years. As I stood there, trying to decide what to do, I heard it, a low, rumbling growl coming from the darkness behind me. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. Slowly, I turned around, my flashlight trembling in my hand. In the doorway stood a figure, its features obscured by the darkness. All I could make out was the glint of eyes staring back at me, unblinking and cold. The growl grew louder, more menacing, and I realized with a jolt of terror that it was coming from the figure. I didn't wait to see what it was. I bolted out of the cabin, running blindly through the woods, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I didn't stop until I saw the faint glimmer of sunlight filtering through the trees. The fog was lifting, and the trees were thinning out. I burst out of the woods and onto the road, my legs trembling with exhaustion. I looked back, half expecting to see the figure following me, but there was nothing, just the silent, dark forest. I never found that trail again, no matter how many times I tried to retrace my steps. My friend, the one who had told me about the trail, swore he had never mentioned it and that he didn't know of any such place. To this day, I don't know what I encountered in those woods, but I've never gone hiking alone again. The memory of those cold, unblinking eyes still haunts my nightmares, a reminder that some places are better left undiscovered. Story 5. The Abandoned Lighthouse. There's a stretch of coast near my hometown that's known for its jagged cliffs and unpredictable tides. It's a beautiful, yet dangerous place, where the sea meets the land with a ferocity that's both awe-inspiring and terrifying. At the edge of those cliffs stands an old lighthouse, abandoned for as long as anyone can remember. The locals tell stories about it. Stories of shipwrecks, mysterious disappearances, and a keeper who vanished without a trace. I've always been fascinated by the lighthouse. As a child, I'd often ride my bike to the cliffs, stopping just short of the warning signs that marked the boundary of safe ground. I'd stand there, staring at the crumbling structure in the distance, wondering what it would be like to step inside, to explore the darkened rooms and climb the spiraling staircase to the top. As I grew older, that curiosity only deepened. The lighthouse became an obsession of sorts, a mystery I couldn't let go. So, when I finally had the chance to go back to my hometown after years of living away, I knew I had to visit the lighthouse, this time up close. It was a foggy afternoon when I arrived at the cliffs. The sea was restless, the waves crashing violently against the rocks below. The lighthouse loomed in the distance, its once white walls now stained with salt and decay. I parked my car near the edge of the cliffs and began the hike towards the lighthouse, my heart pounding with anticipation. As I approached, I could see just how neglected the building had become. The windows were shattered, and the door hung askew on its rusted hinges. The air was thick with the smell of seaweed and salt, mingling with the scent of damp wood and mold. Despite the dilapidation, the lighthouse still held a certain grandeur, a silent guardian of the coast. I pushed open the door, the wood creaking under the pressure. The interior was dark, the only light coming from the fog-shrouded windows high above. The floor was littered with debris, broken furniture, scattered papers, and the remnants of what might have once been a keeper's quarters. The air was cold and damp, and I could hear the distant sound of the waves echoing through the empty halls. I made my way towards the staircase, the iron steps spiraling upwards into the darkness. Each step groaned under my weight, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. But there was no turning back now. I had to see the view from the top to understand what had drawn me here all these years. As I climbed, the wind picked up, howling through the broken windows like a mournful wail. The staircase seemed to stretch on forever, the darkness growing thicker with each step. Finally, I reached the top, stepping into the lantern room. The room was empty, save for the massive lens that had once guided ships safely to shore. It was cracked and covered in dust, but still, it held a strange beauty. I walked over to the windows, looking out at the sea. The fog had lifted slightly, revealing the churning waters below. But as I stood there, something caught my eye, something in the water. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a reflection of the clouds. But as I watched, I realized it was something more. A shadow moving beneath the surface, circling just offshore. I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shadow was massive, far too large to be any sea creature I knew of. It moved with purpose, gliding through the water as if it were searching for something. Then it stopped. I felt a chill run down my spine as the shadow seemed to shift, turning towards the lighthouse. It hovered there, just beneath the waves, and I had the unsettling feeling that it was looking at me, watching me. I stepped back from the window, my heart racing. The room seemed to grow colder, the wind howling louder, almost as if it were trying to drown out my thoughts. I couldn't tear my eyes away from the window, from that shadow lurking in the depths. Suddenly, the room was plunged into darkness. The wind stopped, the sound of the waves vanished, and I was left standing in a silence so complete, it was deafening. I fumbled for my flashlight, flicking it on, but the beam barely penetrated the darkness. That's when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound, like distant thunder, coming from the stairs below. It grew louder, closer, until it was right outside the door. I backed away, my flashlight trembling in my hand, but there was nowhere to go. The only way out was down those stairs, back towards whatever was making that sound. The door creaked open, and the temperature dropped even further, the cold seeping into my bones. I held my breath, expecting to see, I don't know what, person, an animal, something worse, but there was nothing, just the empty stairwell, winding down into the darkness. I didn't wait to find out what was making that noise. I bolted down the stairs, taking them two at a time, my footsteps echoing off the walls. The sound followed me, growing louder and more intense, like the crashing of waves on the rocks. It was as if the lighthouse itself was coming alive, trying to trap me inside. I burst through the front door, nearly tripping over the threshold in my haste. The fog had thickened again, the world outside a swirling mass of gray. I ran towards my car, not daring to look back, the sound of that rumbling still ringing in my ears. I didn't stop until I was safely inside the car, the engine roaring to life. I sped away from the cliffs, the lighthouse disappearing into the fog behind me. It wasn't until I was miles away, the sound of the waves a distant memory, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I never went back to that lighthouse, and I don't plan to, but sometimes, late at night, I dream of it. I see the shadow in the water, circling, waiting, and I hear that sound, the low, rumbling growl of something old and powerful, something that should have been left undisturbed. And every time, I wake up with the same thought. Whatever it was, it's still out there, watching and waiting for the next fool who dares to disturb its slumber.